Hello, Sooner Nation, OU Insider subscribers, Coach Brian Clinton enthusiasts, people who have heard the phrase 4-4 for this Oklahoma football team over the last few days and are still trying to process an Oklahoma football team being 4-4 in the year of our Lord 2024. A lot of fours. This is the podcast for you. This is another episode of The Oklahoma Drill, a podcast fueled by OU Insider and the Rivals Network. I am joined as always by Sir Brian Clinton. And Brian, I got to tell you, I followed OU football for a long time. I wasn't around for the mid-90s. I heard about them a lot growing up. I have followed OU football a long time, and I got to tell you, it's been a few days. We got back from our trip from Mississippi on Sunday, and I think I'm still trying to process 4-4. How are you feel? How are you feeling?
Yeah, it's new. It's not you almost want to chalk it up as like the perfect storm in the wrong way, but it does kind of, with this being the first year in the Big 12 or first year in the SEC, it does kind of make you wonder, where does this team truly fit in the hierarchy? Like, there was all kinds of narratives. I mean, you could ask anybody that followed college football um, before the season started, and pretty much every opinion was going to be one stark difference or another. Like, it was going to be one side of the list or the other, depending on who you asked. And it's kind of hard to argue that Oklahoma's better than anybody in the SEC right now.
I'll contend they're better than Mississippi State.
Yeah, but
Outside of that,
there's a debate to be had, though. That's what's frustrating. I mean,
I'm comfortable Oklahoma will beat Mississippi State. Outside of that, I don't know if there's a debate.
yeah,
Mississippi State's really bad. Mississippi State's really bad.
they are, but they also put 31 up on Georgia. I mean, even as bad as they were, there were times this season where I don't think Oklahoma could have done that. Now, I think that's where you have to take what you saw last week at Ole Miss and like bring that into your repertoire of what you're really looking at from this team as a whole, because that 3-week stretch before, or that 2-week stretch there before Ole Miss was, I mean, that's just, I will say that 2-week stretch is probably the worst 2-week stretch of football that you and I have witnessed since we could understand what was going on. I mean, the last time it was that bad, we were fresh out of diapers, you know?
I remember the 05 and 09 seasons vividly. And I remember thinking, and then obviously 14. And I remember those seasons being 8-win seasons and being like, oh man, this is as bad as it could ever possibly get at the University of Oklahoma. I remember the Rhett Bomar year very well. Very well.
Me too.
I don't know, Brian. Honestly, there's been, so obviously Oklahoma lost 26-14 against Ole Miss on Saturday. They've now lost 3 games by double digits, and those 3 losses, or 3 losses in a row by double digits, those 3 losses combined for a margin of defeat of 69 points. Nice. But Brian, this has honestly made me kind of take stock of what exactly has happened and how it's gotten here. And even that game, even the Oklahoma Ole Miss game, for me is a little tough to evaluate, because that first half, and going back and watching the film, that first half had some legitimately good stuff in it. I mean, offensively and defensively, frankly.
Yeah.
Outside of that opening drive defensively, they were really good. They were really solid. Offensively, it wasn't all amazing, but if you had told me they were going to run the ball for 125 yards on over 4 yards of carry against that Ole Miss defense in Oxford, and they were kind of running the ball at will a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah.
Um, it's hard to, and obviously leading at halftime, it's hard to juxtapose that with how bad that second half was.
Hmm.
So it's almost made it like more confusing for me. And I think one of the things that we should talk about just in terms of look, Oklahoma's playing Maine this weekend. I'm not going to assume anything about this football program at this point, but they're 35-point favorites. Anything less than a dominant win is going to be shocking, and that'll be a whole other discussion if that happens. I I think we should talk about the offensive line. And we have talked about it before this season, but I think we need. I think things have gotten so much to a point that I think we just need to talk about. We just need to give an all-encompassing look at this offensive line. Now, I asked Brent Venables about Isaiah Autry Dent on Tuesday. He gave me a very in-depth, very long, detailed answer on Isaiah Autry Dent. They're going to play him because Jacob Sexton and Jake Taylor are hurt. That's part of it. But Brian, they're kind of in this weird in between where they're not having to pick between trying to stay competitive and trying to develop. Their
Yeah.
hand's been kind of forced a little bit, not only because of the injuries, but because of how bad this offensive line has been. And before we get to some of the young guys stuff, I just in a very broad sense, what do you make of this offensive line through 8 games? Because I honestly think it's been so concerning that it's worth talking about it in a big picture sense. Because and I've heard Gabe Eichert on the Oklahoma Breakdown, who knows more offensive line than I will ever know in my whole life. He's right. A couple of the 10 sacks that they gave up, I mean, almost all those sacks came in the last 10 plays of the game. And a couple of those aren't necessarily fair to put on the offensive line. A couple of those should have probably been called tackles for loss, although, you gave up 15 tackles for loss. I don't know how many more of those you really want either, but he's right. And 10 sacks can be a little bit of it's a number that needs context, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Having said that, this OU offensive line's given up 39 sacks through 8 games. That's the most in the country. Not in the SEC, not in the Power Four.
Yeah.
The FBS.
Yeah.
They are, I believe, they're 3 sacks away from giving up the most sacks allowed in program history in a season.
Yeah.
Back-to-back weeks, they've set a new record for most sacks allowed in a game. I don't know how to. You tell me what you think, because there's so much to make of this, and I do think it's a worthy discussion to really get into it.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot going on. Obviously, you've had a revolving door. Is it 8 different combinations through 8 games?
Seven
Or
different starting combinations.
Yeah, 7 different starting combinations. So that's one. I mean, that in and of itself is one issue. Had a lot of guys miss very vital parts of the calendar, which is fall camp. With injury, you've had guys banged up, not playing 100%. I mean, if you look at it across the board, Babechi Wiwu is really the only guy that has played pretty much every single snap of every game. I mean, it's 98% or whatever. He's been on the field almost the entire season. And we really didn't the first time that we saw like marked improvement from him in a week to week basis was this week. It's really not that surprising when you take into consideration this is only the 8th game he's played for Bill Bedenbaugh. So, you have that. You have the mixture of all of the attrition that this roster has seen the offensive line over the last couple of seasons. Guys leaving early, guys hitting the transfer portal. They have a couple of years of development under Bedenbaugh, and then they're playing somewhere else now, or on a practice squad or in the NFL, but whatever wherever they're at. You had a lot of that going on, but something else that it's just the reality of it is since SEC play started, Oklahoma's been playing from behind. Like every game. They've played
Yeah.
from behind the majority of every game. And so when you're in predictable down and distance situations, which again, Oklahoma has put itself in those situations by negative play after negative play. I mean, it makes it really easy for um, the defenses, those units to really just kind of pin their ears back and come after you. Now, this is going to come off and sound like an excuse. And I know that it is, and I'm probably going to just refrain from reading the YouTube comments after we post this. But when you look at the defenses that Oklahoma has faced, when you look at the top 3 scoring defenses in the country as of right now, you have Ole Miss at number 1, Texas at number 2, and Tennessee at number 3. Those are 3 of the 4 teams that Oklahoma's lost to. You have played 3 elite defensive units, and your offensive line is, I mean, let's call it what it is. It's makeshift, and it's the most inexperienced offensive line Oklahoma has had in the 12 years that Bedenbaugh's been here. So it's a tough combination of all of those things. And then on top of it, when you add the fact that your quarterback is having a hard time processing things as quickly as he needs to, and you have your top 5 wide receivers out, like it literally is just like this melting pot of what you don't need to protect the quarterback and keep him upright. And so there's a lot going on there. I think the one thing that you can kind of point to, and I was happy with this, and I think Gabe Eichert had said something to this extent, but when you remove the sack yardage, and we talked about this last week, when you remove the sack yardage from this last game, Oklahoma goes over 200 yards rushing.
Mm-hmm.
Ole Miss is allowing, they're first in the country in rushing yardage per game, just over 70 yards. And so that's something you can hang your hat on. I think a lot of it had to do with just them finally having some more variety in what they're running, and it looked good. But really, at the end of the day, when you look at who you're putting out there, I mean, Jake Sexton, how many starts did Jake Sexton have in his career? I mean, he's out now for now, but it's not that many, not for Oklahoma. Troy Everett, who has just now made his return to the lineup last couple of games, he's probably your most experienced guy, at least from a perspective of playing for Bill Bedenbaugh. But these other guys, I mean, 8 starts max because it started this year. And there's just not enough continuity to be going up against elite defensive units. And it's just a tough spot. At the end of the day, really, it's not good enough. Like there's no 2 ways about it. It is not good enough. The standard is much higher here. But I will also say, be careful what you ask for as an Oklahoma fan when it comes to firing your offensive line coach or getting somebody else out there, because the standard is what it is, mostly because of what Bill Bedenbaugh has turned it into over the last 12 years. So I would just be very mindful of that. Offensive line is a peculiar situation to coach. It's hard to grade. It's hard. I mean, there's just so much that's going on there, and so I'm rambling at this point. But it is.
Let me step in real quick, because you said something that I really want to get to, which is okay. You mentioned the continuity piece. To me, I think when you're trying to evaluate this offensive line, because you're absolutely right, you have to take all of this into context of who Oklahoma is playing. The fact that these are elite defensive fronts, a lot of these teams, and the fact that This is your first year in the SEC where you're going to have some struggles to adjust. And there's also an injury piece of this that I want to get to as well. But Brian, to me, like, there's two things. One, I think you have to. It's hard to take such a big picture look at this right now because you're still in the middle of the season. But to me, what you just said about attrition at the offensive line, like what we're seeing right now is years in the making.
Yep.
It is a lack of retention in the guys you recruit. It's guys not developing fast enough in the guys that you recruit, and having to lean heavily on the transfer portal, and a lot of that not paying off like Bill Beanbo and the staff was hoping it would.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of those are important to identify because you're now faced with the task of where does it get better? What can you hang your hat on in terms of not only getting better for next season, but how do you build it? How do you build that continuity? How do you do it in a way that you can develop it year after year? And how do you do that in an era of the transfer portal and NIL, and you're doing it with a team that's 4-4 and looking at 5-7 down the barrel? I think that's the concern for me, and that's why,
yeah,
and then the other side of it is these fronts that Oklahoma is facing are legitimate, but and not everything's been perfect for Texas, but Texas is making the same transition. Now, their schedule's been a little bit easier than Oklahoma's, little.
And they return one of the more veteran offensive lines.
But that's why they are able to have success right now. Correct. Is also years in the making. Yep. It's how they've approached that offensive line room and how they've developed them.
Absolutely.
And there's a missing link, and it's not everything is apples to apples, but you have a fellow Big 12 program that also made the jump and is going through the SEC in year one that just looks not only light years ahead, but there is a clear model. Like they can make this sustainable. I think that's maybe the concern with me is, it hasn't been all horrific. That first half against Ole Miss was good. And they with sack adjusted, they ran for over 200 yards. But they're going to play the exact same schedule next year, just home and home flipped.
Yep.
And you could almost put this under an umbrella term of like, it's not the most fair thing. The game is different than it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago. It's different, and it almost makes it impossible to evaluate a 1-year season, right? Because of how much roster changes, how unstable everything is. But at the same time, you kind of have to still judge it. Sure. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of people that are feeling negative right now, and they should, or like it's understandable. I don't think it's all been negative, but man, I don't know, man. I think I do worry about, okay, how do you build on this and how do you make it better? Yeah. Where's the help coming from?
Yeah,
I guess.
Well, the situation, I think six of those sacks came with 5 minutes, right around 5 minutes or less in the game. Oklahoma had a few possessions there, and obviously just dropping back to pass at every point there. So that's just not getting in predictable situations is one thing. I also think, that's where Oklahoma's had the most success defensively, is when they've been able to get teams in obvious passing situations. That's when you can tee off. So that's part of it. But the other thing is, until this last week, and I'm not the only one that said this, I had no idea what the offensive identity was of this team. Like, period. No idea. To me, it was, I've got a wall-to-wall chalkboard and I am throwing crap on the wall and seeing what sticks. Like, it was just whatever you came up with that week. And that affects a lot of position groups. But when you don't know what your identity is as an offensive line, that's tough. Like I mean, there's no rhythm to it. There's no cohesiveness. There is no like you're not just moving. I still, and we had this conversation, I think a few times between Oklahoma and Mississippi on the road. How can you expect to have any continuity at all on the offensive line if you are switching not only positions, but the side of the ball that you're on? Like you've got guys playing left tackle that you're switching to right tackle, vice versa. Like it's just been a total mess. Um, and I think what makes it really hard for me to really pull anything from it is not only are we looking at this individual season, but there's going to be a microcosm of this season in the fact that you changed offensive coordinators in the middle of it. So you have now you will be able to now you'll have to compare what did the first half of the season look like versus what did the second half of the season look like on that side of the ball. Do we see continuity, and how much do we attribute that to guys just being more experienced, or is it because everybody's on the same page now? I mean, there's just so much that goes into really being able to analyze it. And I think for moving forward, one of the things that you have to understand is this this recruiting class that's about to come in. Those guys, um, you've got highly touted dudes coming on the offensive line. Obviously, that's what a lot of OU fans are going to point to and say, help's on the way. What you really need it to be, though, is, and I'll just put it this way, if you don't find a way to a bowl game and you don't get those 16 practices for the young guys like uh, Isaiah Autry-Dent, like Eddie Pierre-Louis, if you don't get those practices, you really put yourself behind the eight ball for next year. You do return a lot of these guys.
Presumably. That makes it hard too, though, right?
Presumably,
Presumably.
you return a lot of these guys that you want to return. Um, I'll put it this way. The defensive line, whenever Brent Venables took over, was atrocious. It was bad. It was really bad. He's the defensive coach, though. But what we saw Oklahoma do last year in the portal was go out and get guys over the last 2 years, was go out and get guys who have become contributors along the interior of the defensive line, and they've recruited well. There cannot be a bigger priority. There cannot be a bigger priority at all whenever the transfer portal opens up for Oklahoma to go out and address the offensive line. Like, I mean, that has to be priority 1A, 1B, and 1C. I mean, the money, your everything that you're setting aside, everything that you're setting aside resources wise has to go there. And if it doesn't, I don't feel confident in saying that things get better next year. You have to, there's just, you missed, honestly. Like that's the big thing. You missed on the guys that you were needing to be difference makers this year. Spencer Brown had nothing personal against the guy. No reason he should be a part of that offensive line room from what we've seen. There's just not.
Let me, just because I don't want to lose what you just said. So the defensive line is a really good comparison because who are the biggest contributors on the defensive line this season. It's R. Mason Thomas, it's Grayson Halton,
Yep.
Ethan Downs, Dominic Williams, and then you throw in
Jaden Jackson.
Jaden Jackson, obviously Jaden Jackson, and then DeJoun Terry, Caden Woolard. Almost all those guys are guys that OU recruited out of high school and developed and got some snaps here and there their first couple of years. But Grayson Halton in his third year, probably been the best defensive lineman this season.
Yep.
R. Mason Thomas, third year. And I mean, he hasn't had the stats the last couple of games that he did the first 4 or 5 weeks. He's still been awesome.
Yeah.
He was really good on Saturday without the stats. He caused a lot of chaos.
Yeah.
Ethan Downs, who has, I think, moved from the lightning bolt of some of the hatred of the fan base to he's just established. He's just really damn solid. Yep. Ethan Downs is just really damn solid.
Yep.
Then you look at the offensive line and they drafted Sexton, they drafted Taylor. It's really hard because those guys have been hurt, right, for a lot of their career, and they're dealing with injuries now. But I almost think what this is getting into is if you're Oklahoma, there's an immediate urgency to get better now to improve next year. But I think you almost shoot yourself in the foot if you go to the portal looking for immediate upgrades. Because for one, if those guys are older guys, they're probably not going to stick around that long. And two, if you miss out on them, you set yourself further back.
Right.
So I agree with you.
It's a very delicate.
It's a very delicate dance because I agree with you. The biggest priority in the portal this year needs to be the offensive line. But you kind of start looking at this a little bit like a professional sports team where if you start dying for that immediate big time hit, you're putting a lot of stock in that guy that if it doesn't work out.
Yep.
And, look at Texas, who has, for one, like you mentioned, a lot of returning guys, but a lot of those guys are guys that Texas recruited and then developed, where even on OU's defensive line, Dominic Williams has been a key consistent piece this year, but their mindset, what's worked for them is they've had guys that have been in the system that they've been able to develop. And then the transfer portal has just been a way to like cement it. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
They haven't had to replace the entire defensive line through the portal.
Right.
That's, that's almost this delicate balance too. And also the more you have to go to the transfer portal to get guys, the less you're giving reps to these young guys, which is why I'm curious about looking at, these next couple of weeks is you kind of have to play Isaiah Autry-Dent now.
Yeah.
You probably should play Eddie Pierre-Louis now.
You probably should. Yep.
Right?
Yes. Well, and that's one thing that I do want to make sure before we put a bow on this offensive line talk is I don't know that you're going to see positions outside of offensive and defensive line that make bigger gains in an off season from strength and conditioning from that perspective. And so young guys like Heath Ozida, Logan Howland, as much as he might be he's a trigger point right now for Oklahoma fans. The improvement that you could see year over year from guys like that having experience this year as freshmen to their sophomore years, redshirt sophomore years, it could be huge. Like it legitimately, those guys could be night and day players next year based off of what we've seen. Because not only do they have the experience, but it's another year in the weight room. And a lot of Oklahoma's issues on that side of the ball, quite frankly, have been physical. They're just not strong enough. So you have that. And yes, it's time. It's time to play the young guys. You have to. You're not really even necessarily punting to next season at this point. It's been that bad.
You kind of need to.
You
just kind
of out of necessity, you have to play them.
Yeah.
So
I would say, I would say this, and this is the last thing I'll say. But there's obviously been a lot of subject or a lot of talk about Bill Bedenbaugh, not only this season, but he has been a topic of discussion around or for a lot of OU fans. And there's probably a bigger variance in opinion about him than any other coach on that
Yeah.
staff. I think this is the best way I can put it about Bill Bedenbaugh is I think it's clear when he's got guys in his system year after year, that is when he's at his best. I think the hard part right now is there's not a lot of continuity, both because of everything we've just talked about, plus injuries.
Mm-hmm.
But now now you're throwing a bigger need to go to the portal and hope you hit right away, and also juggling the fact that this is a 4-4 football team.
Yep.
That's like, I think in a lot of ways the current circumstances aren't necessarily favorable for how Bill Bedenbaugh functions at his best.
Right.
At the same time, that's only going to last for so long, and there's going to have to be improvement.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. That excuse won't buy you another season after this. Like, I mean, I think it works this year for sure. I mean, I just don't see them getting rid of him after this year, even though it's been as bad as it has been. But you get halfway through the season next year and it looks the same. At that point, you've kind of used up your good grace. This is almost like Brent Venables, his 6 and 7 year in year one. This is the year. Okay, you've been good. You've been one of the best in the country for 12 years, but this is atrocious. You are the worst in the country at sacks given up, tackles for loss allowed. So we got to get it right, and that's just the nature of the beast. That's kind of how it goes. So, yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. But there's probably not another guy out there that I would point to and say he has a better shot of making this right than Bedenbaugh does. But that's still a tall task, man.
It is. We've got a lot more to talk about. We're going to take a quick break, and then maybe the mood gets more positive. Maybe. It might. You wrote a story about some positives to take away from Ole Miss. We'll talk about that and a couple other things. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Brian, here's another thing that I want to mention to you. And again, part of why we're having this kind of big picture discussion right now is because Oklahoma's playing Maine this weekend, right? They're not playing Missouri or Bama or LSU. So this season's not over. And, you know, we want to know how I know? Because, Brian, you and I have to go to every game from here on out. We still have a trip to Columbia, Missouri next week, and then a trip to Baton Rouge, Louisiana at the end of November. So believe me, the season's not over yet. But because this is a little bit of a break in the schedule, quote unquote, I want to ask you something else before we move on to your piece that you wrote for OU Insider and then this weekend. Because the program is 4-4, there's obviously, I think some of the discussion now is turned to Brent Venables and his future with the program, right?
Yep.
And there's so many things that we could dive into that we're not going to dive into right now. We just can't. We don't have time. Season's not over. I want to ask you this. I've seen several people say it's hard to really know how to evaluate, or maybe it's even unfair to evaluate Brent Venables this season, in part because of the amount of injuries, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not just offensively, which is what I'm going to focus on, but even defensively. I mean, Gentry Williams has played 19 snaps and he's out for the year. That hurts.
Yep.
Kendall Dolby being out, and that's something we haven't talked about a lot, that hurts.
Yep.
He was probably the second best defensive player on this team through the first 4 weeks.
I would agree.
That's how good he was playing. All that hurts. But offensively, it's not just the offensive line with Garen Hadgett being out for the year. Branson Hickman had dealt with injuries. Jacob Sexton's obviously hurt. Jake Taylor dealt with injuries. To me, Brian, I think part of why that slip happened again in the second half happened against Ole Miss was I think you saw the limits of this offense. You saw the limits of this personnel.
Yeah.
So especially when you look at this hurt wide receiver room, I honestly think Saturday was the first time that not that I've always known that if you had Deion Burks and Jalil Farouk, that obviously those guys would make a difference. I've always known that.
Sure.
But Saturday was the first time to me that I was like, oh, you can really feel how much their absence limits this offense because they were up at half. It felt like in some ways they squeezed everything they could.
Yeah.
And then Ole Miss made adjustments.
Yep.
OU shot themselves in the foot with some bad plays and bad penalties. And you just saw the limits of it.
Right.
How fair is it to evaluate the way this season has gone because of those injuries, particularly on the offense? I know that's kind of a hard question, but I think that is something that people are asking themselves right now because of where this program's at. How realistic is it that things would be different, and how much can the injuries be an excuse, or you still have to do the best you can with what you got, and this is where we are. I'm gonna add because I know people on our boards, they're asking that kind of question right now.
Sure. Yeah. So losing there's going to be some fatigue around the answer I'm going to give at wide receiver, but just because people are sick of hearing it doesn't make it any less true. Losing your top 5 pass catchers, it cannot be overstated how big of a loss that is. Reason I say it that way is because when you aren't able to stretch the field vertically outside of a Brennan Thompson.
Throw him the ball. Also,
Right.
sorry,
Yeah.
random aside. Throw him the ball.
When you're not able to stretch the field vertically, it makes it really hard to stretch it horizontally because you're not forcing safeties to back off. You're not forcing corners to play off ball. You're not forced. I mean, there's just everybody can be up at the line of scrimmage, and so your shallow routes, everything that you're trying to run in the running game, like it makes it all that much harder because I mean, literally, it comes down to common sense. Everybody's closer to the line of scrimmage. They're closer to the ball. It's a lot easier to play defense that way if you're not having to worry about anything 20 yards downfield. The other thing that it does that probably a lot of people aren't talking about is Jesse, let's say you and I are our main defensive coordinators or whatever team, defensive analysts, defensive coaches. And we sit down and we're watching film on Oklahoma. What are you going what are you going to key on? Like, what are the things that we're looking at in film? We're going to look at Bauer Sharp because he's been getting the ball a lot. Javonte Barnes. We see that Taylor Tatum is electric, but he's got a turnover problem. Back and forth at quarterbacks. They're not throwing the ball to 15, so you can probably get away with single coverage there.
Throw him the ball. Sorry.
Right. Yeah. But what I'm getting at is you can really focus on those things in practice all week long, and you're not going to overlook anything. I don't think that's happening on college football coaching staffs. It's just not they're not overlooking a lot of things, but you can really key in on what Oklahoma does well because there's just not very much of it that they've done well. And that's why it feels so limited when you get into that second half and you make some adjustments on what Oklahoma did well in the first half. It really does limit what they're able to do offensively. Now, a lot of that honestly was self-inflicted issues in the second half. A lot of it just came down to the fact that Oklahoma all of a sudden couldn't convert on third down, which is frustrating, obviously, for that coaching staff. But
7 of 9 in the first half, 1 of 9 in the second.
Yes. So a lot of a lot of those are self-inflicted. And that makes it difficult. But as far as like really looking at this season, it's impossible to call it a wash because of the how much intrigue there was coming into the year with them being their first year in the SEC. Like there was always going to be high expectations or high excitement for this team. Um, you've had awful luck. You've had awful luck in the injury department, and unfortunately, those injuries have piled up really in two key categories, and those have severely limited what you can do on the offensive side of the ball. So it's not the answer. It's not some revolutionary yes or no answer, but it is the truth. The fact that it's really difficult to have any kind of expectations offensively when you lose your top five guys. And I also want to preface all of this, or um, I want to tag this with, I truly, honestly believe after watching the Oklahoma game against Ole Miss, I don't know that Seth Luttrell wasn't the worst hire that Brent Venables, not of Brent Venables' tenure, the worst hire of an offensive or defensive coordinator that Oklahoma has made this century.
That's that.
And like I don't I'm not attacking the guy. I want that, like, nothing personal against the guy whatsoever. But the fact of the matter is, Brent Venables elevated him to run somebody else's offense. It didn't work. And instead of handing the reins over to the guy that Levy said should run the offense, they gave it to the guy who was more senior. He had seniority, whatever the reason was. Um, and it ended up being the biggest mistake of Venables' career to this point. And that's a fact. And the thing about it is that falls solely on Brent Venables' shoulders. He is the head coach. He is the guy responsible for making that decision. He placed all of his eggs in that basket, and now it's blown up in his face. And unfortunately, now he's in a position where he better fix it and get it right, or it could cost him.
That's what I was gonna say. Is I do think you have to give the injuries are a real thing, and it does make it hard in some ways to evaluate the offensive side of the ball. Same time, good Lord, that Luttrell hire looks awful.
Yep.
Hindsight's 2020. I understood it when it happened. And no, Saturday did not mean they fixed all the issues. They still only scored 14 points. They still only had 94 yards in the second half. Now,
Yep.
yes, a lot of it is because of sacks, but still lost the football game. Still
Yep.
only scored 14 points. You've now only scored 61 points, offensive points, in 5 conference games. It's really bad. That first half offense, and yeah, you can chalk it up to Ole Miss not knowing exactly what to prepare for because Joe John had never called plays before. That was just an offense that looked like it made sense.
Yep.
That looked like it was functioning somewhat normally, that had some sort of identity where plays bled into other plays that bled into other plays.
Yep.
And yeah, not all the double pass, probably don't call that there at that time of at that position on the field and that time of the game, right? The play on 4th down on the first drive, awkward. It was odd and awkward. Wasn't the right play call. But holy cow, it just looked way better.
Yep.
And that does make the Luttrell hire in hindsight, or the elevation in hindsight. That is, if you're looking for something, that's probably what it is. Yep. But Brian, we've got just a few minutes left, and OU does have a football game this weekend. They have to go on the field and play a game against another opponent still. And I want to say part of why it feels weirdly right to be reflective right now is because Brent Venables had a 66-minute press conference on Tuesday. Right. I have sat through a lot of Brent Venables pressers. I have sat through a lot of Brent Venables Zooms. For anybody that doesn't remember when he was first hired in late 2021 and those Zooms we had, goodness, some of those were long. Mm-hmm. This That was a state of the program, is what that was. That's what his press conference was a state of the program.
Yeah.
They still have to play another game this weekend. And it is a game that they are favored to win by 35 or 34 and a half, I believe is the line.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't going to be the most telling sign of where this team is, and fans aren't going to drastically turn their views around this program because they beat the hell out of Maine. But you wrote that there were some positives against Ole Miss.
Yeah.
So, Brian, what positives are you looking for Oklahoma to build on?
Really, some of the most encouraging things from an offensive perspective was the offense had not just an identity but a rhythm. Like there was RPO and play action stuff off of like zone insert, zone zone slice, split zone, like these things that they have run in the past. Um, they kind of brought in a lot more uh, counter action stuff that we've seen just run at Oklahoma and Jeff Lebby's system and prior to that. And you could tell that there were things that the offensive line was fairly comfortable running. So
Yeah.
like that was one thing. How do I know they were comfortable running it? Because they got off the ball with some velocity. They actually they knew where they were headed, they knew what they were supposed to do, and they got there in a hurry and they were aggressive about it. And if there was one thing that you come away from this game feeling pretty good about, it's the effort that we saw, but it's also the physicality because regardless, like I honestly I think it's a lazy I think it's a lazy take. I've heard the take. Ole Miss didn't know what they were going to run. Um, I mean that's part of football. You put
Yeah.
new things in every week. That's to me that's lazy. When you watch the film back, Oklahoma's offensive line in the run game had movement. They created movement and space for the running backs to take advantage of, and they were physical. And then on the other side of the ball, on the defensive line they did the same thing. They controlled Ole Miss in the running game. So like you got to feel good about the physicality there. But what I think is going to be essential, what's vital for Oklahoma at this point is you've got some film on what it should look like now against quality competition. And the next 3 weeks are so important for your offense, for the entire, not just the outlook of the season, but these next 3 weeks are so vitally important because one, you've got a Maine game this week that essentially it's an exhibition game. Like let's call it what it is. There is no reason why Maine should come into Oklahoma and challenge the Sooners. There's just not. That's a team that you're going to pay hefty figures to come and get whooped and go home. Like that's the reality of it. Could they lose the game? I mean, we've seen things happen before. It would be the biggest. It would be the biggest upset in the history of college football if Maine came to Oklahoma and beat Oklahoma, which is even at 4-4, it's just a different level of football. We're talking it's huge.
If Oklahoma loses to Maine at home, I think the program might burn to the ground.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. I think there would be firings before Sunday. Like it would just be, yeah, it would be
that
bad.
night.
So, anyways, this is an opportunity for you to play young guys, as we kind of talked about, Isaiah Archer-Dent. You've got to see some young guys on the offensive line. I think this is a game where you build some confidence for some of the younger guys. Taylor Tatum being one of those because you need him. You need him down the stretch. You need him to be able to hold on to the football. But the reason why, building off of the positives that we saw in this game, your physicality is going to be something that needs to travel to Missouri. You've got to take the game to them. Like that is, if you are going to pick up if you're going to pick up win number 6, that's going to come right there. It is. You lose that game, I just have a really hard time seeing you turning things around after the bye week. Um, you win that game, you get some confidence going into the bye week. Maybe you make those other two games competitive and give yourself a chance to win. If you go to Columbia and lose that game, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really tough to figure some things out. So, um, I think this 3 week stretch, including the bye, is really important for the offense because this is you are going to install. I honestly look at this week. I think why I take away positives from this last week is because this was essentially week one all over again for the offense. Like, I mean, now you're building on pretty much install. So you look at it from that perspective, and then the other thing that and this is probably the biggest X factor for Oklahoma, especially if they can get some guys back healthy, which it kind of feels like they should get a couple of guys at receiver back by that Missouri game. Hopefully, we'll see. You know, I'm not holding my breath, but that's kind of the hope, right? Um, I think Jackson Arnold reminded people uh, of the caliber of player that he is and is capable of being. I think the fan base and I mean even myself to an extent, you almost forget just how ballyhooed of a recruit he was based on what we saw from him against Tennessee and what got him benched. Like you almost forgot, oh, he can do things like that. And we saw a little bit of that against Ole Miss. And so if he can continue to build on that, this next 3 week stretch is really big for them. And the other thing, the other positive that you take away from this is the last 4 games that Oklahoma has played, last 5 games that Oklahoma's played. You are not going to see a defense the rest of the way that's as good as any of those that you've played in the last 5 weeks. Missouri is not a defensive elite, an elite defensive team. Alabama has more weaknesses on the defensive side of the ball than they've had in the entire tenure of Nick Saban being there. And LSU is more comfortable outscoring you than they are playing a defensive game. So, you know, you do have that going for you. It's just this is. I feel like we're saying this every week now, but it's so important. Like you've got to get things right this week. You got to feel confident, and then that Missouri game is kind of what your season hinges on now.
Here's what I'm going to say. I'm glad you mentioned Jackson Arnold, who I thought played pretty well. Wasn't perfect. I thought he played pretty well. I was stunned at the lack of deep balls. Mm-hmm. Did he throw one? I'm trying. I went and watched the film back on Monday, and I'm trying. I don't know if he attempted one. The longest passing play of the game was 20 yards.
He tried to hit. He tried to hit Brennan Thompson deep, but severely underthrew it because he was under duress.
I don't even know if they gave that target to. I don't even know if they gave a target to Brennan Thompson on that play.
It was way off. But
so, yeah. There was at least some intermediate passing stuff. I mean, I think he averaged almost 11 yards per completion, which is a healthy number. That's a fine number. Mm-hmm. I was shocked at the lack of deep ball attempts. And Gabe mentioned this on the Oklahoma Breakdown. He's right. Brennan Thompson is open down the field. He's open.
Yeah.
Throw him the ball. I know I've said that loudly twice already.
Well, but it's the truth.
Throw him the ball.
Yep.
It is remarkable the amount of snaps he's played this season and the lack of production. And it's not really his fault.
No.
So if you're asking me what I'm looking for against Maine, it's like you said, I want to see the young guys play, especially on the offensive line. I just want to make sure I see that in past situations that they hold up, because that's where they struggled. That has been their biggest issue all year, is especially in obvious passing downs. I want to see them have no issues, regardless of who is on the offensive line with Maine. There should not be any issues defending that defensive line. I want to see Jackson chunk the ball down the field.
Yep.
There's no reason not to. And you're going to need to do that against Missouri, Bama, and LSU to have any chance. Again, we saw the limitations of this OU offense against Ole Miss. They did some really good things in the first half, but Ole Miss did not feel threatened down the field.
Right.
And especially because I don't think Missouri's very good. I'll just be honest. They got their doors blown off by Bama and Texas A&M.
Yep.
Now, is Missouri going to be favored? Yes, and they should be. Missouri is probably still a better football team than this universe and that's not a hot take. But Missouri isn't very good. And as good as Jackson Arnold looked in the running game and some of his passes were better against Ole Miss, the one thing that he can do at an elite level when there's confidence and he has time is throwing the ball deep.
Yep.
And Brendan Thompson's open. And there are plays there's plays that Brendan Thompson's open and they're not looking at him.
Right.
Throwing the ball.
Yep.
Oh my goodness, throwing the ball. And then I want to see them continue that momentum they had from running the ball last week. They should dominate Maine's defensive line.
Yes, they should.
And I want to see Javante Barnes and Taylor Tatum, whether, I don't know if Gavin Sawchuk will be able to play. I want to see them have season best days, and because there's no reason for them not to.
Right.
And ultimately, yes, it's Maine. No one's going to care if OU wins by 1 billion points, but generate some sort of confidence where things are easy and you're doing explosive plays and you're asserting your will, because OU hasn't done that all year. They didn't even really do that against Temple. Not really.
No,
they scored 51 points, but it wasn't, I wouldn't have said it was dominant. Dominate Maine. Just beat the hell out of them.
Have to.
Beat the hell out of them.
This is your one chance to do it this year.
And then hopefully we come back next week on the Oklahoma drill and we can talk about young guys that looked good and things we liked and things that we think they can build on against Missouri.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. I don't want to talk about a boring ho-hum 21-point win, 14-point win, or God forbid, a genuine close game. Again, I'm not going to assume anything at this point. I would still say the odds are astronomical that Oklahoma doesn't dominate this game. Yeah. If they don't, that's a problem. I don't care what the injuries are. It's a problem if they don't dominate this game.
Absolutely. No, it should be 40, 48 nothing, like easily. Like I can't even believe we're having this discussion. It needs to be dominant. It needs to be a confidence builder. I mean, this is one of those games where you haven't proven a whole lot this year offensively. Now's your time to prove that you can do at least some of the basics right. And I think that's really what it boils down to. Is if Oklahoma's athletes can do the basic things in football properly against Maine, you should be able to score points at will. It is plain and simple. If you can't, like you said, that is a huge problem.
Here, fall softball on Friday. It's the Gasso Bowl on Friday in Norman. The Gasso Bowl. The two head coach Gassos going at it. We'll have coverage from that as well. So much stuff going on right now. You're not going to want to miss it. And like I mentioned earlier, we didn't get as much of a chance to dive into this as I was hoping we would. But Brian wrote his weekly Pick Six series, analyzing some plays from the Ole Miss game, some positives that Oklahoma can build on. And hey, as negative as things are right now, everybody needs some positives. Go check that out. So much stuff going on here at the OU Insider YouTube channel and at the OU Insider VIP. OUinsider.com, the VIP board. You're going to want to join both of those. But as always, thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see what happens against the Maine Black Bears this weekend in Norman. We'll have you covered from there as always, and we'll be back next week on another episode of the Oklahoma Drill. Thank you guys as always. We'll see you then.